If you go to a number of public events, you hear the land acknowledgement in one form or another, and it's kind of just something that passes by. But in fact, you really think about it. There was a time when the whole of what's now southern Ontario was the hunting and fishing ground of these various Indigenous peoples over the years. And in fact, in the presentation you're going to see today, you will come across one of the groups that for a while had one of the largest areas in what's now southern Ontario. So it's always something to keep in mind when you hear that kind of by rote thing. So what you're going to see is a pseudo play. So I will be playing Egerton Ryerson. He didn't have a beard, but the rest of me matches. This is what he looked like, except he had a vest on in his last photograph. So you're seeing Egerton Ryerson in about 1880, just a couple of years before he died. So he's getting near the end of his life. And two people are going to come in, and they're going to query him about various aspects of his life. These people are from the future, they're from today. So they will use some terms he doesn't understand, and they will have to explain it. On the other hand, he will use some language that they misinterpret because language has changed over the years. So we're not going to all aspects of his life, but important ones. And at the end, we'll have time for questions. So sit back and enjoy yourselves. Come in.
Hello, Mr. Ryerson. Apologies for not announcing myself when it came up.
That's quite all right. I asked my housemaid, this is my day for receiving people, I asked my housemaid to keep them downstairs and just send them up one at a time. I'm not feeling very well today. So please have a seat.
Thanks so much.
Tell me your name and why you're here.
My name is Oskar Hanson. I'm here to ask a few questions about First Nations residential schools.
Excuse me, sir. I don't understand this term First Nations. What do you mean by it?
You would call them Indians, I believe.
Thank you. Yes, it's been many years since I spent time with my Indian brethren, but I have fond memories of the time I did.
Okay, great. My first question is it true that you did not like them and disrespected them as many have said?
What? Where are you getting these terrible, terrible ideas? I loved my Indian brother. Let me tell you about it. I was born in 1803, and I was still a young man in 1825 when I joined the Methodist Church as a minister on trial. In 1827, I actually became a minister. But while I was still on trial, I was sent to the Yonge Street Circuit as a circuit rider. And I would ride from what was then York all the way up to Lake Simcoe, preaching each day to different people. But in 1826, I was appointed to the Credit Mission. And the Credit Mission was, obviously, it was at the mouth of the Credit River. And this involved the Mississauga people. The Mississauga at one time had roamed a huge area of what's now southern Ontario. But by various treaties, they'd given away most of the land. I'm not sure they entirely understood they were giving it away, because in their idea, land was something you used, you didn't own it. But anyway, they only had a tiny sliver of land on the Great River left. And a man who became my best friend for as long as he lived, he unfortunately died young, known as Cocker or Peter Jones in English. The translation would be sacred feathers. And this man decided that in order for the Mississauga to survive, they had to settle down and start farming. So they settled down at the mouth of the Credit. It wasn't actually on the land that they still had left, which was a bit further north. And there they built a village, and they started farming. And they sold their crops and timber from the local area to Toronto by water. And with government help, they built houses, they built a school church, and I was their first minister. Peter Jones himself became a minister, as did many other Indigenous people. I grew to love these people. I was only there a little over a year, but I really grew to love them. They were learning farming. I was a farm boy. I was strong. I was vigorous. I could work long hours. So I would work in the fields with them and show them things I knew. And I learned enough of their language that I could actually give sermons to them, preach to them. And they appreciated all of this. In return for me doing that, they actually, in a ceremony, gave me the name of a recently deceased chief, Chichok. This is a mark of respect. Chichok, by the way, means bird on the wings, because I was always running around doing things. And I only stayed a little over a year, but during that time, as I say, we became very close. This is not me disliking, this is me. I really fell in love with them.
Wow, thank you so much. It sounds like, based on your experience, they really respected you. My next follow-up question is, were you not the architect of the residential schools?
Again, I'm sorry, I don't know what residential schools are. I don't know the term.
Louder.
They were schools set up by the federal government, and their goal was to assimilate Indigenous culture into white society.
That sounds awful. I would never have anything to do with something like that. I did help to set up industrial schools. Again, I'll have to explain it to you. In 1846, the government that had been trying to get the First Nations, as you call them, or Indians, to congregate in a few central areas to get them out of the way of settlement. So they had a large meeting with the government and the British Indian Department and the chiefs of most of the nations, as you call them, in the southern part of the colony of Upper Canada. And they said to the chiefs, come together in a few settlements and we will give you education. And the chief said, no, we don't want to move. We're quite happy where we are, but we do want education. We do want to learn how to fit in to the society of the Europeans who come. 2 or 3 of them said, no, we don't want that. They went back to their people, and the people said, yes, we do. We do want this. So in 1847, George Varden from the Indian department, a senior person in the Indian department, contacted me and said, we're going to set up schools to teach Indians how to farm. And we need a curriculum. You've been working on education, you passed an Education Act, you must know something about this. Please tell us what we should do. Well, I was pretty busy working on education. And so I didn't get around to it for a while. I got another letter from George Varden reprimanding me and saying, it's very important we do this. There are groups of people who will want to cancel this. And it's important that we have this to put the Indian on an equal footing with their white brethren. That's what he said. So I got it going. I worked on it quickly. And this is the only thing I did, by the way. I didn't have any part in running the schools. But I came up with something. I based it on a school I'd seen in 1844-45. I traveled Europe looking at various schools, various types of education. And I saw a school for boys in Switzerland, which seemed appropriate. So I took the basic idea from there. And the idea was that there would be religious instruction, there would be education as they would have in a school in Euro-Canadian society, I guess you'd call it. And they would spend a lot of time in the fields working, learning how to farm. So the idea was that they were going to become farmers. The government promised land. They would go, in my idea, they would go to the mission schools that existed in their communities, and then they would go to these industrial schools, and they would learn how to farm. And when they finished, they could be the overseers of large farms. They could be farmers in their own right. And as I saw it, eventually the what did you call them? First Nations would take over the schools, and they'd run it for themselves. In fact, my good friend Peter Jones was to take over one of them, but he became ill, unfortunately, and couldn't do it. Now, these schools, the way they worked was you went voluntarily, you were taught by teachers that had been trained in the normal school that I set up in Toronto, trained teachers. Students could speak their own language, they would learn in English. And they were free to leave. So this is purely voluntary. And what they were learning was a regular education, such as other children would get, plus learning how to farm. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a lot. It sounds like it was even a different name, the industrial school as opposed to the residential school, and the intentions were much different than what ended up the federal ends.
Absolutely.
Ended up instantiating.
That's what I know.
However, is it true that you refer to the First Nations as uncivilized, and if so, does that contradict that you respected them so much?
I'm sorry, sir, but I don't understand. I mean, perhaps you don't understand. Being civilized was to be as advanced as possible. So civilization was set up, you started out as semi-nomadic, you went to hunter-gatherer, and then you went to the civilized stage. It's what the Europeans had. So that's what I was recommending. I wasn't in any sense saying something negative about them. They just, in order to survive and compete on an even level, they needed to be at the same level.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. I do have a direct quote that I was hoping you could clarify further in the context. It's, it's a segment. As it is a fact established by numerous experiments that the North American Indian cannot be civilized or preserved in a state of civilization, including habits of industry and sobriety, except in connection with, if not by the influence of, not only religious instruction and sentiment, but of religious feelings. Is it not true that you said that?
It was a long time ago, but yes, I would have said it. That would have been in my letter to George Varden. This is something that all of we Methodist missionaries said, and there were dozens of Methodist ministers who were Indians. And a lot of the chiefs said the same thing. The point was that Native society, Indian society, First Nation society, if you want to call it, it had been seriously deteriorating. By the time that I wrote that letter, less than 1% of the people in Canada West, as it was called, were Indians. When they lost their ability to hunt and fish at will, they lost hope. They settled into lethargy, they settled into alcoholism, and their society was rapidly declining. So what the Methodists were offering and what the chiefs wanted was to educate people in hard work, to avoid alcohol, and to farm. And to do that, you needed religion. That is the whole principle upon which the Credit Mission was established. When my friend Peter Jones and his brother established it, there was no alcohol allowed, and they wanted to have religion so that people would know the benefits of hard work and of respect. It worked there. There were only about 200 came together at the beginning, but they actually flourished. So the idea of what I said there was that this was contributing to helping them to learn to farm.
Thanks a lot for the explanation. So did you recommend using Christianity to eliminate indigenous culture? And was that what the goal of the Methodists were?
Hardly. That's offensive. I'm surprised you would say that, sir. Let me tell you, most of the indigenous people, a majority in what is now southern Ontario, had converted by the 1830s, before I was heavily involved. And they converted because they saw benefit in this. You know, any idea that we forced them or we coerced them suggests that these people were simple, which they were not. They knew what they wanted. They knew that this would help them. So they adopted Christianity. And that Christianity helped them to get ahead, helped them to understand what they needed to do in life. And more joined the Methodist Church because of that. The idea that we were trying to destroy their culture. As they say, they were smart enough to know that this wasn't going to happen. What they did is to graft Christianity onto their existing ideas. They added to their culture, I guess you call it, instead of taking away from it. So there was nothing in there that would harm them.
Well, thank you so much for the clarification, Mr. Ryerson, and thank you for your insights as well today.
Thank you, young man. Thank you for dropping in. I hope you've learned something, and you will have greater respect for me and for Indigenous people.
Will do. Thank you.
Come in?
Mr. Ryerson,
Yes, please.
sorry for coming in unannounced, but your maid told me to come right in.
Yes, this is my day for receiving people. I'm not feeling very well. I apologize for not standing, as I should, for a woman.
That's fine. Thank you.
I've been having a lot of periods of illness. I have a feeling that I'm approaching the end of my life, that I'm going to meet my God, which I welcome. So what brings you, what is your name and what brings you here?
My name is Rose Dyson, and I'm here because I'm interested in hearing a bit about your views on education, universal education.
Oh, thank you. That is a topic after my own heart. I accomplished many things in my life, but what I did for education, I believe, is my greatest accomplishment. In 1844, 45, I took a trip to Europe. I went to various schools. I studied education. I arranged to have copies of great works of art brought back. And in 1846, I started working. I did a series of 3 education acts, and I totally changed how education was offered. You're old enough to remember the early days in what was then Upper Canada,
Yes.
where schools, there are only very small number of government schools, really tiny. So if most people wanted education for their children, they had to build a school, hire a teacher, look after that person, provide wood for the fire, provide food and lodging for the teacher, find books, which were usually American, which gave them the wrong ideas of what British society is about. And the teachers didn't have to be very qualified, so the education usually wasn't very good. So as my education acts, I changed all that. Education was to be funded by taxes. Eventually education would be free. There were trained teachers. I set up a normal school behind the education department, and we trained teachers to send out to the schools. We created textbooks so that they would get a good British education. All of these artworks I brought back were in a museum so people could come and see what our history was. I created a library and a book depository to help the teachers. And eventually, my crowning touch was education that had to be accepted by all children. Something that they were required to do. Because in the old days, they just took off in the spring and fall to work on the farms. And education was very hit and miss. There were a lot of people who really didn't know very much. So my acts really helped with this. And I understand they're starting to copy this elsewhere in the Dominion of Canada. Thank you for asking.
Well, I'm quite aware of your accomplishments in this area. They're extensive, but there's one aspect in particular I was interested in getting your views on. Is it true that you recommended separate schools for black students? And obviously they wouldn't have the same level of education.
Blacks, oh, you mean colored students?
Yes.
No, I didn't do that. As a civil servant, I was superintendent of education. I did not create schools. I simply recommended. But even then, I saw black education, colored education as an evil. I wrote the Attorney General in 1847. He was really the Prime Minister. I'd been to London, Ontario, and people there said, we want black separate schools. There were about 200 colored families living in the area. And the white settlers said, we want separate schools for them. If a black student, a colored student comes into our school, all the white students will leave. So I wrote the Attorney General and I said, this is terrible. I've tried to talk these people out of it, but they are adamant they will not have their schools shared with black students. So I said in my letter to effectively the Prime Minister, listen, this is a blot on our Constitution. We cannot put this through our legislature. So here's what I suggest. That you allow cities, towns, incorporated villages to choose what they want in the way of education. This was accepted, and in that way, it meant that most of what's now Ontario did not have colored schools. There are only a few areas around London, around Hamilton and Niagara that had black schools. The rest of the province was free of this evil. On the other hand, if any colored families wanted to set up a school, they had the right to do so, but very few did. I did run into problems later on. Some of the black families wrote me and said, we're paying taxes and we can't go to the white school. And I said, I'm sorry, but I'm a civil servant, I can't do anything. Go to the courts. And some of them did, a few did, and in some cases the court said, yes, you have a right to go. So I was dead against this because, as you mentioned, I believed that everyone should have an equal education. We are all God's children. And no matter whether you're colored or you're white or you're an Indian, you're entitled to the same level of education.
Well, if that's the case, why would you have established separate schools for the disabled? Wouldn't that have been discriminating against them?
Madam, if you were a man, I would call you ignorant. Think about it. Most of our schools are one room or two room, and one or two teachers. They teach multiple classes, multiple grades. How could they possibly also give an equal education to even people who couldn't speak or couldn't hear or couldn't see? So I recommended, it hasn't happened yet, but I recommended they have their own schools so they would get an equal education to everybody else. Far from discriminating against them, I was trying to help them.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ryerson. I think I have a better idea of where you stand on education.
I hope you do. Thank you for dropping in. Again, I apologize for not getting up.
That's fine, thank you. I don't want to trip over anything yet.
So that ends the performance. If you have any questions, comments? Oskar, you're not supposed to clap. You're part of this cast.
You have great futures as actors.
Thank you. Do you have questions? I'll hand you the mic.
Thanks, Ron. Does it go? Does it go that far? Ron, I have a question about Catholics. What's your position? I mean, you're a Methodist minister, Mr. Ryerson. You know the tensions of 19th century Canada with all these Irish people coming in, they're all Catholics. They're agitating for their own education. They don't really trust the public school system. What's your position on Catholics? And there are also French Catholics and all this to complicate your life. What's your position? What was your position?
Thank you for that question. It's complicated. In my mind, Catholics, whether French or English speaking, should have been educated just like everybody else. But before I became superintendent of education, the government had already passed legislation establishing separate schools for Catholics. In the 1850s, they expanded that system. So there was nothing that I could do. So I defended that system, I guess you'd say. I defended against people who said they shouldn't have their own education system. Because it already existed, it's the best we could do, and the idea was that they would get an equal education, although in Catholic schools. And that's the best I could do. But I wouldn't discriminate against them. I just thought that ideally they would be students with everybody else. But since they already had their system, then I supported it against all attacks. And there were attacks. There were people who simply didn't believe that the Catholics, that French Catholics, should have the right to a separate education. I hope that answers your question. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Ryerson. It's not a question, it's just an observation that you have suddenly brought out in my mind, that education was intricately involved with farming back then.
Very
And there were rules that seem quaint now, that people in rural areas would be automatically passed from one grade to the other, even if they didn't finish the school year, because they either went to work for their fathers on the farm, or went to their neighbors, or signed up for the harvester's excursion, where young men went to Western Canada to help with the thrashing. And I suddenly realized, my brothers did that. In 1940s, they were still getting, my next oldest brother got his grade 9 because he dropped out, signed something, or had my father sign something, and he was automatically passed to grade 10. By the way, I did go to a one-room school.
Education was difficult, which is why I did what I did. I mean, in the spring, on the farm, you had to sow the crops. In the fall, you had to harvest them. Everybody had to help. So students would simply go off. And some were bored. So they just left. There was nothing to compel them to be there. And some became apprentices in a trade. And they thought, well, I've got enough education. So yes, education was hit and miss. Unless you were very well-to-do and you went to a private school, or you were lucky enough to be near one of those government schools, you weren't going to get a very good education, which is why I'm so proud of what I did. I changed the whole idea of education. I made it important in people's lives. And as I said, I understand that it was copied elsewhere. That this was something that people wanted for their society.
I have another question, Mr. Ryerson. Can you say something about the 1847 letter that is troubling a number of us now? Just did you write it, or did you not, or was it interpreted the right way, or what is the background to it?
Yes, I mentioned to you, I mentioned to Oskar that in 1847 I was asked by a senior official in the British Indian Department to come up with a scheme, a curriculum for this set of schools. So what I did was to write a letter. It took a while, but I wrote a letter giving my idea of what the curriculum should be. As I understand it, I wasn't involved with running the schools. That was done by the Indian Department. But as I understand it, my ideas were followed fairly closely. So religious teaching first thing, probably something like Sunday school. And then education as you would have in the schools elsewhere in Ontario. And then in the afternoon, long hours in the fields, working to learn farming. So this was just a short letter with all of this information. But the whole idea was to say it's important that the students, the Indian students, learn habits of industry, learn habits of farming, and learn habits of morality so that they can succeed. It's unfortunate those schools did not survive long. The government, as governments are wont to do, said they would set up 3 schools. They only set up 2. So the Indians in the north stopped sending their children to the school, and they cut off the payments that they made from their treaty payments that they got each year. So that hurt the schools. Then the government promised there would be land that these graduates could farm. They didn't give any land. And I understand that for a lot of the students, these long days were just too much. So they would simply go home. So one of the 2 schools had closed by Confederation by 1867, and the other one was on life support. It wasn't for want of trying. But the whole idea was to give these people a chance to survive, for their society to survive. It couldn't survive in the old ways, as I said. They'd given in. The population, the Indian population was, First Nations was it? The First Nations population was shrinking, and they just sat around and drank a lot of the time. So this was to give them hope, and it was to give them a chance to get ahead. It wasn't about trying to change them into anything. It was a chance. It was an attempt to give them hope.
But you are criticized for this letter, so I'm wondering why. Did you say they could be mere agricultural workers? That's one question. And the second is, why did you say they could be good agricultural workers and not doctors and lawyers?
No, I never said they could be mere farmers. I said that they could be the overseers of large farms, or they could farm on their own. They weren't to be farm laborers. This was a chance for them to be like everybody else.
But the president of Victoria College accused you of that.
Victoria College? I can't imagine they would do that. I founded that. Why would they say that? The accusation is not true, sir. Someone has twisted my words or ignored my words. As I said, the idea was, in fact, that the Indigenous people would run these schools and train other people. What was your second question?
Why didn't you say they could be doctors and lawyers? Why just agricultural workers?
Oh, because that's what, I don't know what percentage, but probably 80% of the people were at the time. There was nothing stopping them. In fact, I advanced the careers of a couple of Indian students who had been very good students. I actually helped them to get ahead in jobs like doctors and lawyers. So I wasn't against that. But for the majority of them, they would be like the majority of society. So there's nothing stopping them going on to something else. Anything else? Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. Egerton, thank you. I thank you.
We wish you well.
If anybody who wants to get a more detailed examination, if you go to the website, Friends of Egerton Ryerson, at the top, there's a little tab that says videos. Click on that, and you'll see a set of videos that various of us have made. There are 2 short videos, part 1, part 2, of something that says Words from Egerton Ryerson. And it is an expansion with pretty pictures of what I've been talking about today. So you'll actually get more information.